There is a terrifying paradox when it comes to the concept of human connection. We are told that when romance turns sour, a broken heart can tear you apart figuratively. It leaves an invisible, aching void. But, as the dark annals of true crime have proven time and time again, there is a much more sinister side to desire. When affection is unrequited, when love twists and mutates into a festering, one-sided obsession, it might just end up tearing you apart in a violently literal sense. Welcome to today's broadcast. Step into the dark with me. Today, we are going to navigate the labyrinth of one of the most chilling, frustrating, and haunting unsolved mysteries to ever grip South Korea. It is the story of a brilliant young woman who simply evaporated from the face of the earth. But this wasn't just a physical vanishing. Her digital footprint held darkest secrets, and her entire future was systematically and clinically deleted from existence by someone consumed by a terrifying obsession. This is the case of Lee Yoon. If you were to look at the last known photographs of 29-year-old Lee Yoon Hee, you would see a woman radiating quiet confidence. She was bright, immensely popular among her peers, and driven by a fierce ambition. Hailing from the city of Namyangju, Yoon Hee was the kind of person who seemed destined to leave a significant mark on the world. During her undergraduate years, she walked the prestigious halls of Yuha Women's University in Seoul. There, she poured her intellect into a dual major of fine arts and statistics. It was an impressive academic feat, the kind of resume that promises a lucrative, stable corporate career. But shortly after donning her graduation cap, a heavy realization settled over her. Neither the canvas nor the spreadsheets ignited her soul. They were not her true calling. Beyond her deep love for her family, there was only one thing in the world that truly captivated Yoon Hee: animals. She was a woman who would spend her weekends utterly absorbed in nature documentaries. She frequented zoos, volunteered at farms, and wandered through animal sanctuaries. At home, she was a devoted mother to beloved dogs, doting on them with a warmth she rarely showed anyone else. It was this profound, undeniable passion that pushed her to make a remarkably brave and highly controversial decision. At the age of 25, a time when society expects you to have your path firmly paved, Yoon Hee decided to tear up the map. She was going to become a veterinarian. Her family, traditional in their views, fiercely protested. They argued that abandoning her previous degrees to chase this new dream was a reckless waste of both time and money. In their eyes, at 25, she should be shifting her focus toward finding a suitable husband, getting married, and settling down into a quiet, respectable life. But Yoon Hee was a fiercely independent, modern woman. She refused to be boxed in by expectations. Against her family's wishes, she took the plunge. In the year 2003, she proudly enrolled at the Chung National University's School of Veterinary Medicine. By the summer of 2006, she had proven all her doubters wrong. She was merely one single semester away from earning her degree. She was diligently preparing for her grueling final exams, balancing her studies with an exhausting work schedule. Because she had chosen to walk this path without her family's financial backing, Yoon Hee paid her own way through medical school by tutoring younger students in her free time, including the children of her very own university professors. She was exhausted, but she was happy. She was on the precipice of achieving her ultimate dream. Then came the 2nd of June, 2006, an omen of the nightmare to come. It was a Friday evening. Yoon Hee had just wrapped up one of her private tutoring sessions and was walking home through the bustling city streets. Without warning, the roar of a motorbike engine ripped through the air. Two unidentified men sped past her on the bike, swerving dangerously close to the pavement. A hand reached out and violently snatched her handbag right off her shoulder. The thieves sped away, taking with them her wallet, her identification cards, and, crucially for the dark events that would soon follow, her cell phone. The bystanders witnessed the brazen robbery. Adrenaline pumping, they leapt into their van and gave chase, tailing the motorbike through the labyrinth of the city for several blocks. But the thieves were reckless and desperate. They banked hard into an impossibly thin, dark alleyway, disappearing into the shadows. They were never seen again. That same night, a visibly shaken and deeply distressed Yoon Hee returned to the university campus. She found her classmates and delivered a message that, in hindsight, carries a heavy, chilling weight. She told them she wouldn't be reachable by phone for the foreseeable future. "Just thinking about those bastards makes me want to cry," she confessed, her voice trembling with the violation of the mugging. The world can be such a scary place. Tragically, she didn't know the half of it. The true monsters were not on a motorbike. They were already circling her. 3 days later, the calendar turned June 5th. It was a monumental day for the veterinary students. Yoon Hee and her cohort had successfully completed their final, agonizing internship of the semester, a high-stakes practical exam that involved performing live surgery on an animal. To bleed off the immense pressure of the semester, the students and their professors organized a massive celebration on the outskirts of town. Yoon Hee, however, was paralyzed by anxiety. She was a perfectionist, and she was convinced she had botched her surgical procedure. The stress broke her. That afternoon, some of her classmates found her locked inside one of the laboratory bathrooms, weeping uncontrollably. They rallied around her, offering gentle words of consolation, assuring her she had done fine. After much coaxing, they finally convinced her to dry her eyes and join the festivities. She deserved to celebrate. The night kicked off at a vibrant karaoke bar at around 10:00 p.m. By all accounts, the dark cloud over Yoon Hee had lifted. She was laughing, singing, and appeared to be in genuinely good spirits. From the neon lights of the karaoke joint, the large group, consisting of over 40 students and several professors, migrated to a dimly lit, local pub. The drinks flowed freely. The air was thick with the sound of clinking glasses, boisterous laughter, and shared memories of their time at Chunk National. But as the clock struck 2:00 am, the atmosphere fractured. Yoon Hee suddenly emerged from the pub's bathroom. The warmth and joy had been entirely drained from her features. Witnesses would later recall that she wore an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. Without pausing to speak to anyone, without so much as a goodbye to the friends who had consoled her hours earlier, she made a beeline for the exit and hurried out into the cold night air. One person noticed her sudden, panicked flight. A 27-year-old male classmate, known in the official records only as Kim. Kim and Yoon Hee shared a long history. They were reportedly very close, having attended the same school long before their university days. Seeing her distress, Kim instantly abandoned his drink and chased after her into the street. He caught up to her, breathless, and asked what had happened. Yoon Hee looked at him, trembling, and allegedly confessed that someone had just followed her into the pub's bathroom. She offered absolutely no further elaboration. She didn't name the stalker. She didn't detail what they had done or said. Yoon Hee lived alone in a modest, small studio apartment in Jeogni, situated roughly 5 kilometers, or just under a mile, from the pub. It was a long walk for a woman who was terrified and without a cell phone to call for help. Concerned for her safety, Kim gently took her heavy backpack and offered to escort her home. This was not an unusual occurrence. Kim often walked her back after their nights out. The pair navigated the quiet, sleeping streets of the city. According to Kim's official statement, they eventually arrived at the precipice of a pitch-black, narrow alleyway located very close to her apartment building. It was here that Yoon Hee suddenly stopped. "Well, this is me," she reportedly told him. It was a clear dismissal. She was indicating that he did not need to walk her the rest of the way, right up to her front door. Kim handed her the backpack. The pair exchanged their goodbyes, and Yoon Hee turned around, disappearing alone into the swallowing darkness of that alleyway. Kim claimed he began walking in the opposite direction toward his own home, but, he noted, a deep sense of unease washed over him. He couldn't shake the fear in her eyes from earlier. He stopped, turned back around, and kept his eyes glued to the dark facade of her apartment building. A few moments later, a light flicked on in her window. Breathing a sigh of relief, satisfied that she was safely locked inside her sanctuary, Kim turned away and went home. He would be the last person to ever admit seeing Lee Yoon Hee alive. The following day, Tuesday, June 6th, was Memorial Day in South Korea. It was a national holiday. The university campus was dead, and the city was quiet. Because of the break, none of her friends thought it was strange that Yoon Hee's landline remained unanswered. Everyone assumed she was sleeping off the alcohol and the stress of the semester. But when Wednesday, June 7th arrived, and Yoon Hee failed to walk through the doors of the lecture hall. A ripple of genuine concern passed through her social circle. Yoon Hee was not the type to play hooky. She was relentlessly diligent, a hard-working student who rarely, if ever, missed a class. Her absence was a glaring red flag. After the lecture ended, a close friend named Minji decided to check on her. She walked to the apartment in Jeogni and knocked heavily on the door. Silence. Since Yoon Hee's cell phone had been stolen days prior, there was no way to text her. Minji assumed Yoon Hee was still recovering from a severe hangover or pure exhaustion, and simply needed another day off. She left. But then came Thursday, June 8th. Yoon Hee missed her classes yet again. Furthermore, she completely failed to show up to several social events she had explicitly planned to attend with her friends. The red flags were now a blazing siren. Unable to shake their dread for of her classmates Minji, the man named Kim, and two others identified as A and B, marched together to Yoon Hee's apartment building. As they approached her door and knocked, they were greeted by a sound that made their blood run cold. Inside, Yoon Hee's two beloved dogs were barking frantically. It wasn't the happy yapping of pets greeting a guest. It was the desperate, shrill howling of animals in profound distress. But still, no human footsteps approached the door. The apartment was secured by a heavy digital door lock, a system that required a specific numerical passcode to disengage the deadbolt. None of the four friends standing in the hallway knew the combination. Frantic, Minji pulled out her phone and called Yoon Hee's older sister, but the sister was just as confused. She hadn't heard from Yoon Hee in days and had no idea what the door code was either. Out of options and suffocating with worry, the classmates dialed the police. The authorities quickly contacted the landlord, who arrived with a master override to force the door open. As the heavy door swung inward, the investigators and the friends were immediately assaulted by a rancid, putrid odor. It was the overwhelming stench of dog urine and feces. The apartment was a nightmare of neglect. The two puppies were found lying weakly on the floor, shaking from severe hunger and dehydration. They had been abandoned for days. In their desperate bid for survival, the starving animals had scavenged the entire studio, looking for anything to eat. The floor was a chaotic mess of torn paper, shredded clothing, and scattered debris. But amidst the chaotic mess the dogs had made, detectives noted something that sent a chill down their spines. High up on the wall, there had previously been a decorative dried bouquet of flowers. It was hung well out of the reach of the small dogs. Yet, this delicate bouquet was now lying crushed on the floor. It strongly suggested that a physical struggle had taken place in the room, violent enough to knock items off the walls. Furthermore, Yoon Hee's heavy backpack, the very same one Kim had carried for her on the night of the party, was sitting right there on the floor. This was undeniable proof that Yoon Hee had not vanished in the alleyway. She had successfully made it inside her apartment in the early hours of June 6th. When investigators unzipped the backpack, they found two medical syringes and a glass vial filled with an animal anesthetic. These items had been quietly taken from the university's veterinary lab. Despite the ominous signs, the crushed flowers, the starving dogs, the stolen medical supplies, the initial responding police officers made a catastrophic error in judgment. They looked at the chaotic scene and concluded there was no immediate evidence of foul play. There was no blood on the walls, and the door showed no signs of forced entry. The cops casually suggested that Yoon Hee, overwhelmed by her exams and the recent mugging, had simply suffered a mental breakdown and left voluntarily for some rest and relaxation. They assured the terrified friends that she would likely return in a few days. That dismissive explanation did not sit well with the four classmates. Not for a second. They had already called her family. She wasn't with them. More importantly, leaving her beloved dogs locked in a room to starve to death without food or water was completely, fundamentally out of character for the passionate animal lover. She would have never abandoned them. To disappear without a trace was simply not the Yoon Hee they knew. Frustrated and unsatisfied with the police's lazy conclusion, two of the classmates, Minji and B, left the apartment and marched down to the local precinct to forcefully file an official missing persons report. The other two classmates, Kim and Da, volunteered to remain at the apartment to wait for the imminent arrival of Yoon Hee's parents. What happened next would permanently cripple the investigation. Standing in the rancid, foul-smelling apartment, Kim and decided that the place was simply too much of a pigsty. They felt it would be deeply embarrassing for Yoon Hee's respectable parents to walk into such filth. So, driven by a misguided sense of politeness, Kim and decided to clean the apartment. And they didn't just tidy up, they went to work. They filled buckets with soapy water and viciously mopped the floors. They gathered up all the scattered papers and dog-chewed fabrics and threw them into garbage bags. They stripped the bed of its stained blankets and clothes, tossing them into the washing machine and blasting them with detergent. In their tragic attempt to preserve their missing friend's dignity, they systematically, thoroughly, and inadvertently obliterated a massive, irreplaceable goldmine of forensic evidence. By the time they were done, the crime scene was sterile. The tragedy of errors didn't stop there. When Yoon Hee's older sister finally arrived to inspect the studio, she stepped out onto the small veranda. There, resting on the floor, she found a single, used cigarette, but Yoon Hee was not known to be a smoker. The sister, horrified by the thought that Yoon Hee had picked up a secret, shameful habit, and wanting to protect her sister's image from their strict parents, picked up the cigarette butt and threw it in the trash. The sister would later be haunted by this action. Was that cigarette really Yoon Hee's? Or was it dropped by the person who had been waiting for her in the dark? The saliva, the DNA, the absolute confirmation of a killer's presence in that room. It was all cast into the garbage, lost forever. Kim, and the sister have lived with the crushing regret of that afternoon for nearly 2 decades. They hadn't realized the apocalyptic magnitude of their mistakes, because the police hadn't taped off the room or instructed them not to touch anything. The thought of preserving a murder scene hadn't even crossed their minds. They thought they were helping. When Yoon Hee's parents finally arrived that evening, the sterilized apartment offered no answers. But the father, Lee Dong-se, was a man who paid attention to details. As he scanned his daughter's painfully empty studio, he instantly realized that 2 highly specific items were missing from the room. The first was a heavy hammer. Lee Dong-se was absolutely adamant about this. He had personally purchased and gifted that tool to his daughter for basic DIY repairs. He knew for a fact that she always kept it out in plain sight. It was gone. The second missing item was far larger and deeply unsettling. Her beloved coffee table had vanished. This wasn't just any piece of furniture. Yoon Hee was deeply attached to this old, battered table. She used it for everything. She ate all her meals off it, studied on it, and used it as a makeshift bedside table. In fact, a male friend of Yoon Hee's, a student identified only as S, had visited her apartment on the very morning of June 5th, a mere 16 hours before she was last seen alive. He had come specifically to repair one of the table's wobbly legs. S confirmed to the police that Yoon Hee loved that table and had absolutely no intention of throwing it out. He had stayed at her apartment for about 30 minutes that morning before the 2 of them walked to class together. Notably, S did not attend the celebration that evening, and he never saw her again. It is also worth mentioning that hushed rumors circulated the campus that Yoon Hee and S were romantically involved, though no concrete proof was ever found. So where was the table? Driven by a desperate need for answers, Yoon Hee's father began wandering the neighborhood, scouring the streets for any sign of his daughter. It was during this frantic search that he made a chilling discovery. Tucked away between 2 filthy dumpsters in an alley outside the apartment building, hidden carefully beneath a pile of other discarded trash, was the wooden tabletop. But it had been mutilated. All 4 of the metal legs had been meticulously unscrewed and removed, likely using a tool. The legs were nowhere to be found. While police initially theorized that a local homeless person might have stripped the metal legs to sell for scrap, Yoon Hee's father harbored a much darker, far more terrifying theory. He believed that a violent confrontation had taken place inside that apartment. He theorized that his daughter had been brutally murdered, perhaps bludgeoned with the very hammer he had given her, and that her blood and the killer's DNA had splattered all over her favorite table. To hide the evidence, the killer dismantled the table, hid the blood-stained top, and took the metal legs and the hammer with them into the night. Despite the family's agonizing pleas, the authorities dragged their feet. It wasn't until June 10th, for full days after she had last been seen, and over half a week since anyone had heard her voice, that the police finally realized he was not on a vacation. A specialized task force was assembled with the singular goal of hunting down the missing student. The team descended on the Geogmi apartment, armed with forensic kits and luminol. But they were too late. Kim and had done their jobs too well. The floors were spotless. Not a single foreign fingerprint, footprint, drop of blood, or stray hair could be extracted from the sterile environment. Robbed of physical evidence, the detectives had to go old school. They began knocking on doors, canvassing every single resident in the apartment complex. They asked a simple question. Did you hear a commotion in the early, dark hours of June 6th? The building was cheaply constructed. The walls were paper-thin, completely lacking sound power. If a violent struggle had occurred, if a woman had screamed for her life or her dogs barked frantically, someone should have heard it. Yet not a single tenant reported hearing anything out of the ordinary. However, there is a massive caveat to this silence. Many of Yoon Hee's neighbors actively refused to cooperate with the police, slamming their doors in the detectives' faces. But one neighbor did speak, and what she said poured gasoline on an already terrifying fire. A female resident living in the same building reported a horrifying encounter that had occurred just a few days prior to Yoon Hee's disappearance. She told investigators that as she was walking home, she realized she was being shadowed. A young, sinister-looking man had stalked her through the streets, following her all the way to her front door. She described the paralyzing terror of fumbling with her keys, knowing this silent predator was standing just feet away, waiting for the lock to click so he could barge his way inside. Finding a surge of adrenaline, she spun around and aggressively confronted the man, shouting at him. Startled by her fierce resistance, the stalker turned and fled into the night. The witness looked the detectives in the eye and suggested a horrifying possibility. What if that same predatory stranger, having been thwarted by her husband, simply wandered the halls of the building until he set his sights on a new, more vulnerable target? What if he found Lee Yoon Hee? This is not a baseless fear. South Korea has a documented, terrifying epidemic of stalking. Just as recently as 2019, security footage captured a young woman in Seoul being followed to her apartment by a man in a baseball cap. As her door began to close, the man sprinted down the hall and threw his hands against the wood, desperately trying to force his way in. Her automatic digital lock engaged a mere millisecond before he could breach the threshold. He stood outside her door for minutes, staring at the handle, before walking away. It is a nightmare scenario that haunts women across the country. Did Yoon Hee fall victim to a similar predator waiting in the shadows of her hallway? While a random attack was possible, statistical reality dictates a different narrative. The vast majority of victims are taken by someone they know, someone within their orbit. Believing Yoon Hee was not a random target, the task force launched a massive interrogation campaign, pulling in all 40-plus attendees of the June 5th party. They interviewed everyone. They subjected Kim and 21 other students to grueling polygraph tests. Every single one of them, including Kim, passed without a hint of deception. Though, as any seasoned investigator will tell you, polygraph machines are notoriously unreliable instruments of truth. The search expanded. Catalogs were brought in to scour the dense, unforgiving mountains surrounding the city. Tens of thousands of missing person flyers were blasted across telephone poles and shop windows. Nothing. No bodies. No witnesses. No leads. Except for one disturbing discovery. Directly adjacent to Yoon Hee's building stood another apartment complex. Detectives noticed that one specific unit in that neighboring building possessed a perfectly clear, completely unobstructed view directly into Yoon Hee's studio apartment. Whoever stood at that window could watch her every intimate movement. Detectives tracked down the landlord of the adjacent building. They learned that the apartment with the perfect view was currently unrented. It had been totally vacant for several months. But when the police breached the empty apartment and walked over to the window facing Yoon Hee's life, they found a chilling scene. The floor directly beneath the sill was littered with several empty cigarette packets and dozens of used, crumpled tissues. Someone had been standing in that dark, empty room. Someone had been smoking chain after chain, watching Lee Yoon Hee through the glass, waiting. Unfortunately, Despite forensic analysis, no usable DNA could be extracted from the decaying tissues or the faded cardboard. The voyeur remained a ghost. As the days bled into weeks, the fragile optimism held by Yoon Hee's friends began to crumble. They had tried to convince themselves that the stress had just broken her, that she had run away to clear her head, that she had thrown out the table herself, and that the tissues next door belonged to a harmless squatter. But that desperate hope was completely annihilated when the Cyberarchma division finally cracked the hard drive of Yoon Hee's personal computer. The digital forensics revealed a timeline that is nothing short of a horror story. According to the unalterable data logs deep within the machine, someone had sat down at Yoon Hee's desk and woken up her computer at exactly 2:00 am on the morning of June 6th. This timing perfectly aligns with the moment she would have unlocked her door and stepped inside after Kim had left her at the alleyway. The user opened a web browser and navigated to Naver, South Korea's premier search engine. In the dead of night, in an empty apartment, the user frantically typed 3 specific search terms into the bar: sexual harassment, contact police, 112, the South Korean equivalent of 911. The digital footprint paints a picture of pure panic, but the most terrifying detail is the duration. This frantic search for help lasted for exactly 3 minutes. At 2:03 am, the browsing abruptly stopped. The computer sat idle in the silence of the room. Then, an hour and 19 minutes later, at precisely 3:22 am, the machine was manually and deliberately shut down. This behavior was incredibly anomalous. Like many people of her generation, Yoon Hee was known to perpetually leave her computer running in the background, day and night. Her historical data logs confirmed this habit. Powering it down was a stark deviation from her routine. Given the razor-thin timeline between her entering the apartment and the internet searches, detectives are almost certain that Yoon Hee herself was the one typing at the keyboard. This suggests a horrifying reality. Yoon Hee had been assaulted. Whether the attack happened at the party, in the pub's bathroom, or during the dark walk home through the alleyway, she was violated. Because her cell phone had been stolen days prior, her only lifeline was the internet. She ran inside, booted up the computer, and desperately searched for a way to quietly report the monster. But why did she stop after only 3 minutes? Did the adrenaline crash, leaving her paralyzed by fear? Did she reconsider reporting the crime out of shame? Or, far more terrifyingly, did she stop typing at 2:03 am because the person who assaulted her had just kicked in her front door? Did the killer rip her away from the keyboard, end her life over the next hour, and then cleanly power down the computer at 3:22 am to plunge the room into total darkness before slipping away into the night? The digital horror didn't end there. Where experts discovered a second, massive anomaly. Days later, between 2:15 p.m. and 5:21 p.m. on the afternoon of June 8th, someone booted the computer back up. Using a highly specific, obscure piece of software called IE History View, a program not widely known or used by the general public in South Korea. This unknown user systematically and permanently deleted Yoon Hee's private chat history on Natom, a popular messaging application similar to Skype. Every single message she had sent or received between 10:48 p.m. on June 4th and 3:04 p.m. on June 8th was nuked from the hard drive. It was an unrecoverable, surgical strike on her data. The implication is staggering. The person operating the computer was not a panicked brute. They were ex-Avi, and they desperately needed to hide whoever Yoon Hee had been talking to in the hours leading up to her disappearance. Had someone messaged her? Had someone lured her out of the apartment? The mystery deepened when, on June 10th, someone remotely logged into Yoon Hee's music streaming account and checked her personal emails. Police furiously traced the IP address, hunting the digital signal to a cheap motel in the sprawling metropolis of Seoul. Detectives raided the motel and pulled hours of CCTV footage, searching for Yoon Hee or her killer. They found nothing. No suspicious individuals on the tapes, and absolutely no trace of Lee Yoon. It was a phantom pin. The task force was now staring into the abyss. It was painfully, undeniably clear that Lee Yoon Hee had been murdered, and her body had been masterfully disposed of. Finding her remains was the only way to harvest the forensic evidence needed to unmask her killer. But to this day, nearly 2 decades later, the physical form of Lee Yoon Hee has never been recovered. She vanished like smoke, and investigators have a deeply disturbing, sickening theory as to why. Remember Yoon Hee's profession. She was studying veterinary medicine. As part of their rigorous curriculum at Chung National University, the students routinely gathered animal carcasses, dissecting them in the surgical laboratories. Once the students were finished, the sliced, mutilated animal remains were collected in a specific biomass disposal room. They were sealed inside heavy, opaque, specialized medical waste bags. An external agency would then collect these bags and transport them to a massive industrial incinerator to be burned to ash. Due to strict biohazard company policies, the men hauling these bags were expressly forbidden from opening them or looking inside. Not that anyone would want to peer into a bag full of butchered animals. On a standard, typical day at the university, the agency collected roughly 40 kilograms of animal remains to be fed into the fire. With the logs from June 8th, 2 days after Yoon Hee was last seen alive, and the exact same day her computer data was being wiped clean, show a staggering anomaly. On that specific day, 110 kilograms of bio-waste were wheeled out of the university and incinerated. That is 70 kilograms heavier than the daily average. The school worked with a variety of animals, dogs, cats, sometimes cows or pigs, which could explain weight fluctuations. But the university's internal logs explicitly confirmed that absolutely no large animals had been processed or dissected by the students that week. So where did the extra 70 kilograms come from? The ashes were dumped long before forensic experts could sift through them for human teeth or bone fragments. We are left only with the cold, horrifying math. Lee Yoon Hee was a petite woman. She weighed exactly 45 kilograms. Did the extra weight account for her body, along with the bloody clothing, the missing hammer, and the metal table legs? If Lee Yoon Hee's body was smuggled into the bio-waste bag and burned into nothingness, it radically narrows the suspect pool. It means the killer had intimate knowledge of the university's disposal schedule. It means they had the keys and the security clearance to access the restricted biomass collection room on campus without raising alarms. It means the killer was likely someone from the university. The first person of interest to fall under the microscope was a man known in the files only as Professor Moon. Moon was a lecturer at the veterinary school. He was also the father of the children Yoon. He had been tutoring on the very day her handbag was stolen by the motorcyclists. According to numerous whispers and official statements from the student body, Professor Moon's behavior toward Yoon Hee was wildly inappropriate. He was described as overly tactile, constantly finding excuses to touch her, and relentlessly flirtatious, despite his married status. On the night of the June 5th celebration, the tension between them reportedly boiled over. At the pub, Moon had aggressively tried to force his way into the seat directly next to Yoon. Disgusted, she publicly asked him to switch seats so she could put distance between them, loudly labeling him a creep to her friends. When detectives brought Moon in for questioning, his alibi fractured. During his initial interview, he confidently stated that he had left the pub early, arriving home to his wife at exactly 2:00 am. However, when police confronted him with multiple eyewitness statements from students who swore they saw him lingering at the pub long after Yoon Hee had fled into the bedroom night, Moon suddenly, conveniently, changed his story. The theory surrounding the professor is a nightmare. Internet's loose and armchair detectives suggest that Moon, enraged by her public rejection, cornered Yoon Hee in the pub's bathroom, explaining her terrified exit. Terrified he would lose his prestigious job, his reputation, and his marriage if she reported him, he followed her home. Perhaps he talked his way inside. Perhaps he used his authority to threaten her. But once inside, he ended her life. Using his high-level clearance, he then transported her body to the university's biomass room, or, far more sadistically, drove her there while she was still breathing, executing her among the cold metal tables before slicing her up to conceal her human shape among the animal carcasses. It is a terrifying narrative, but it has a fatal flaw. Unless Yoon Hee left her heavy door wide open after her frantic internet searches, How did Professor Moon bypass the digital passcode lock on her door? This brings us to the second theory, the stranger. Too many. The timeline is simply too coincidental. Mere days before she is hunted, two men on a motorbike specifically target her, snatching her purse. Violent street theft is statistically rare in South Korea. Was this a random mugging, or a targeted operation? The rider stole her keys, her ID, and her home address. Did they use that information to stalk her, waiting in the shadows of her building for the perfect moment to strike? While plausible, it lacks the personal, vindictive rage necessary to explain the meticulous cleaning of the crime scene and the surgical deletion of her computer files. Which brings us to the third, and most hotly debated, person of interest. There is a suspect that we are absolutely certain about, stated Yoon Hee's father, Lee Dong-se, his voice trembling with anger during an interview with Hemgo, a man that used to live near Yoon Hee. He would follow her around like a stalker, but he slipped from our clutches due to a lack of physical evidence. The man the grieving father was pointing his finger at was Kim, the classmate, the friend, the man who walked her to the alley. Kim presented himself to the police and the public as the perfect, concerned gentleman. But investigators quickly realized a glaring issue. The entire narrative of Yoon Hee's final moments rests entirely, 100%, on Kim's word percent. There is zero surveillance footage of the two of them walking side by side through the city. None of the other 40 students at the pub actually saw them leave together. We only have Kim's assertion that he chased her, carried her back, and left her at the alleyway. This has led to rampant dog speculation. Did Kim actually walk with her? Or did he trail her from a distance, watching her from the shadows? I find it hard to believe she would willingly walk down a pitch-black alleyway entirely alone, especially after having her bag stolen days prior and fleeing the bathroom in terror. Why would she dismiss her close friend just yards from her? Unless, of course, the person she was truly terrified of in that moment was the man holding her bag gagged. What is not up for debate is Kim's fixation on Yoon Hee. It was an open secret on campus. Kim was utterly infatuated with her. Yoon Hee would often awkwardly laugh it off with her friends. But rumors swirled that Kim's crush crossed the line into obsession. Classmates reported that he kept a meticulous, detailed journal tracking her daily activities. More disturbingly, there were whispers that he secretly collected stray strands of her hair. Some even speculated that the only reason Kim had enrolled in the veterinary program at Chunk in the first place was because he had followed Yoon Hee there. Despite this, Yoon Hee clearly trusted him to some degree. She wore clothes he had bought for her, spent time with him alone, and listed him as an emergency contact. Too many. Kim was jokingly referred to as Yoon Hee's third puppy, a harmless, fiercely loyal lapdog that padded quietly behind her. Kim himself claimed the feelings were not entirely one-sided, alleging they had shared kisses on for separate occasions, though according to him they were never officially a couple. So if he loved her, why is he the prime suspect in the eyes of her family? Because of one devastating, game-changing piece of information. Let's rewind to June 8th, the day the four friends stood outside Yoon Hee's apartment listening to the starving dogs, unable to get inside because they didn't know the digital passcode. Kim was standing right there with them. He watched Min-ji frantically call his sister. He watched them call the police. He watched the landlord pry the door open. But Kim was playing dumb. Detectives later discovered that Kim had visited Yoon Hee's apartment numerous times in the past. He had gone there to feed her dogs when she was busy. He had dropped off homework. Kim knew the passcode to her front door the entire time. Why did he lie? His defenders argue he was simply protecting Yoon Hee's honor in a deeply conservative society, not wanting to broadcast to the other classmates that he had intimate access to a single woman's apartment. He wanted to avoid a scandal. But to the police, and to her family, it was a siren blaring in the dark. Kim lied about the door code, and then he volunteered to stay behind and clean the crime scene. He was in that apartment, wiping the floors with bleach, throwing away potential evidence. And he was in that apartment with between 2:15 p.m. and 5:21 p.m. on June 8th, the exact, precise window of time when someone booted up Yoon Hee's computer and used obscure software to permanently delete her private chat logs. When detectives dragged Kim and into the interrogation room and demanded to know which one of them had sat down at the desk and wiped the hard Dr. off, both men gave the exact same, infuriating answer. I can't remember clearly. The motive. A tale as old as time. The rage of the rejected. Perhaps Kim confessed his love on that dark walk home, and she rebuffed him. Perhaps the rumors about Yoon Hee and the other man had finally pushed Kim into a jealous, murderous psychosis. Did he assault her, force her to search the internet for help as a sadistic game, before ending her life? Did he dismantle the coffee table, the very table that his rival, had lovingly repaired just hours earlier, as a twisted symbolic gesture of his dominance? The circumstantial evidence against Kim is suffocating. But circumstantial evidence doesn't put a man in a cell. In 2017, journalists caught up with Kim. He had moved on. He was a married man, a father of children, operating his very own, highly successful animal hospital. Refusing to let the fire die, Yoon Hee's aging father, Dong-se, organized relentless protests outside Kim's veterinary clinic, holding signs accusing the doctor of butchering his daughter. Kim did not ignore the protests. He weaponized the legal system, filing a massive defamation lawsuit against the grieving father. The court sided with Kim, issuing a strict injunction that legally prohibited Dong-se from ever approaching the clinic again. Kim vehemently maintains his absolute innocence, claiming the media and the family have unfairly targeted him to cope with their loss. To this day, not a single criminal charge has ever been brought against him. Fashionably, the lead detective who originally worked the case in 2006 has since retired. In recent interviews, he expressed profound regret at how the investigation was handled. He admitted that his team developed severe tunnel vision, focusing entirely on Kim while ignoring other viable leads. The detective stated that, in his professional opinion, Kim is likely innocent. He believes the true monster is Professor Moon, the man with the power, the motive, and the unmitigated access to the incinerator flames. The years have been cruel to the Lee family. They have been tormented by false hope. In 2007, the sister answered the phone to hear a voice saying, "Yoon Hee doesn't have money to make this call. She asked me to tell you she really misses you." The police traced the call, in a frenzy, only to find a severely brain-damaged 27-year-old man in a public phone booth, who had absolutely no connection to the crime. It was a sick, random coincidence. That same year, a psychic medium inserted herself into the tragedy, claiming Yoon Hee's spirit was screaming from a sewage treatment plant. The police dragged the waters. They found nothing but filth. Today, almost 2 decades have passed since the bright, ambitious veterinary student walked into the dark alley and vanished. The authorities have released age-progressed images, haunting digital paintings of what a 47-year-old Lee Yoon Hee might look like today, staring out from missing person posters with eyes that have seen too much. Her father, Lee Dong-se, is now an 82-year-old man. His body is failing, but his spirit is anchored by grief. "I don't know when this 82-year-old body of mine will die," he recently told a reporter, his voice cracking with the weight of 18 years of tears. "But before I go, I just want to confirm whether my daughter is alive or not." In a final, desperate bid to pry the truth from the cold hands of the city, Dong-se and his wife sold their home. They liquidated every worldly possession they owned. They pooled their lives, savings, and offered a staggering reward of 100 million won to anyone, anywhere, who can provide the piece of the puzzle that brings Yoon Hee home. The money sits in a bank account, untouched, unclaimed. The killer walks free. The dogs are gone. The computer screen is black, and Lee Yoon Hee remains a ghost, trapped forever in the dark of that June night. Thank you for joining me in the shadows. Keep your doors locked. And remember, the person walking behind you might just know the passcode. Have you ever found yourself standing on a crowded train platform, or perhaps waiting in line at a bleak, fluorescent-lit post office, and your eyes drift over to the bulletin board? There, staring back at you, are the faces, the most wanted, the ghosts of society. You look at those grainy, unsmiling portraits and you have to wonder, what exactly does it take to earn a spot on that board? What sequence of dark, Irrevocable choices elevates a person from an ordinary citizen to an apex fugitive, hunted by an entire nation. IVE spent a lot of time staring at those faces. IVE spent even more time digging into the lives behind them. Not too long ago, we explored the darkest corners of Japan, profiling their top-tier fugitives. The response to that journey was overwhelming, pulling us into a world where everyday people vanish into thin air. So, I realized we need to keep pulling at this thread. We need to look further. For this second chapter, we are crossing the Sea of Japan. We are putting the magnifying glass over Japan's complex, high-tech, and heavily surveilled neighbor, South Korea. Unlike many nations that let their wanted posters gather dust for decades, South Korea treats its fugitive list as a living, breathing entity. It is an ever-shifting roster of the country's most dangerous phantoms, officially designated as publicly wanted criminals. This isn't a random assortment of lawbreakers. Twice a year, as the seasons turn in May and November, a specialized committee sits down to curate this list. They select exactly 20 suspects to be the focus of aggressive, nationwide manhunts and high-profile public exposure campaigns. Getting on this list is a grim achievement. The committee ranks these individuals based on a dark calculus, the sheer brutality and severity of their crimes, the exhausting length of time they've spent mocking the law while on the run, and the absolute, terrifying urgency of ripping them off the streets. Once selected, the machinery of the state grinds into motion. Roughly 20,000 of these haunting flyers are printed and plastered across the country. They are pinned up in the echoing halls of subway stations, taped to the walls of cheap hotels and steaming public bathhouses, scattered across highway rest stops, and crucially, distributed to countless plastic surgery clinics, the very sanctuaries where a desperate fugitive might seek a brand new face. Statistically speaking, the system works. The authorities report that once a suspect's face is immortalized on one of these public notices, there is a 45% chance they will be in handcuffs within a year. The pressure is suffocating. The eyes of 50 million citizens are suddenly looking for you. But what happens when someone beats the odds? What happens when the year passes, and then another, and then a decade? These are the terrifying, blood-chilling stories of men who have defied the dragnet. Men who have repeatedly stared out from those posters, and who have somehow managed to evaporate into the ether. We begin with fugitive number 1, Wang Zhiya. The bounty on his head sits at 3 million won. To understand the sheer impossibility of Wang's disappearance, you first need to understand the country he vanished in. South Korea operates one of the most impenetrable, heavily centralized identification networks on the planet. The moment a citizen turns 17, they are woven into the digital fabric of the nation. They must register for a national identity card. This isn't just a piece of plastic with a photo. It contains a unique resident registration number, inextricably linked to a monolithic government database that holds their biometric data, including their fingerprints. This is the key to existing in South Korean society. You need it for everything. Want to open a bank account? You need the ID. Need to visit a doctor for a persistent cough? You need the ID. Applying for a job, securing an apartment, or even just trying to access certain websites late at night. You need to prove you are exactly who you say you are at Zayu. You cannot go a single week in this country without digitally validating your existence. Compound that with the physical surveillance. South Korea is a panopticon. The cities are completely blanketed with closed-circuit television cameras. They hang from street altitude. They watch from the corners of convenience stores. They monitor the alleys, the highways, and the stairwells. Tracking a person's movement in Seoul is usually as effortless for the police as following a trail of brightly glowing digital breadcrumbs. So I ask you, how does a man, fully integrated into this inescapable grid, commit a horrific crime and then simply vanish? How does someone stay a ghost for over 17 agonizing years? That is the chilling question that haunts the victims of June 17, 2008. The evening began like any other in Gangnam. It's one of Seoul's most vibrant, affluent, and heavily populated districts, a place of glaring neon, luxury boutiques, and a sense of absolute safety. The time was roughly 8:30 p.m. The muggy summer air was thick with the sounds of a city in motion. Office workers were pouring out of skyscrapers, heading toward the bustling express terminal known today as Central City, eager to get home with her husband. And then, a sound tore through the ambient hum of traffic and chatter. A scream. A raw, visceral shriek of pure terror. Commuters froze. Heads turned. A few brave bystanders pushed their way through the throng, tracking the horrifying sound to a narrow, shadowed alleyway just behind the main terminal building. The scene they stumbled upon was a nightmare bleeding into reality. Lying crumpled on the unforgiving asphalt were two people. A 32-year-old woman who we will call Miss K, and her 33-year-old boyfriend, Mr. Year-old boyfriend. The ground beneath them was slick with blood. A figure moving with the frantic, terrifying energy of a wild animal had just unleashed a massacre. The attacker had plunged a blade into both of them over a dozen times, each. Before anyone could even process the horror, the assailant sprinted out of the alley and hurled himself across a chaotic 8-lane road, weaving through speeding headlights, dodging death by inches until he disappeared into the city's labyrinth. In the chaos, the shadows, and the sheer panic of the moment, no bystander managed to get a clear look at his face. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until paramedics swarmed the alley. Both victims were loaded into ambulances, their lives fading with every passing second. By the time homicide detectives arrived at the hospital, the grim reality of the situation set. Miss K had slipped into a deep, dark coma. She was completely unresponsive. Her partner, Mr. B, however, was clinging to the edge of consciousness by his fingernails. He was bleeding out, agonizingly close to the abyss. The detectives crowded around his gurney, the metallic smell of blood heavy in the air. They knew he was fading. They leaned in close, begging him, pleading with him to summon whatever microscopic shred of strength he had left. They needed a name. Mr. B writhed in excruciating pain. His chest heaved, his breath shallow and dragged. Through gritted teeth and a groan of absolute agony, he managed to force out a single, damning sentence. It was K's ex-husband, Wang Ju-yeon. Tragically, Miss K's injuries were too severe. She would pass away shortly after the brutal ambush, her life stolen in a filthy alleyway. But miraculously, against all conceivable medical odds, Mr. B would survive. The killer's blade had plunged into his chest over and over, but one specific thrust had missed his heart by mere millimeters. Had that blade shifted just a fraction of an inch, Mr. B would have died on that asphalt, and the identity of the Gangnam Phantom would have remained a mystery, costing detectives precious weeks. So, who was the monster who fled across that 8-lane highway? Born in 1975, Hwang Ju-yeon grew up in the quiet, unassuming hometown of Jinmayan. He was a man of many faces, drifting through a bazaar resume of occupations. He worked as a broker for agricultural machinery. He drove a taxi through the neon-lit streets. He even climbed the ranks as an executive in a predatory multi-level marketing pyramid scheme. Wang possessed a dangerous superpower, the gift of the gabon. He was a chameleon, dripping with charisma when he needed to be. He knew exactly how to reel people in, how to manufacture a false sense of intimacy, and how to command unwavering loyalty from the very people he was actively scamming. But beneath that slick, talkative exterior lurked a volatile darkness. He was reckless. He was deeply hot-tempered. He was the kind of man who would fly into a blinding rage over the slightest perceived insult. He was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Hwang met Kay, the woman who would eventually mother his child, sometime in the mid-1990s. Initially, Kay was captivated. Hwang was overwhelmingly confident, and physically, he was an imposing force. Standing at roughly 5'11", quite tall by Korean standards at the time, he was built like a tank. He carried the dense, muscular frame of a man who spent his time striking heavy bags, boasting a background in the brutal martial art of Muay Thai. Yet for all his physical dominance and smooth, talking bravado, underneath the surface, Hwang was profoundly fragile. He was a deeply insecure, possessive man-child who viewed the people in his life not as human beings, but as his personal property. They married in 1997. From the moment they exchanged vows, the relationship was a nightmare. It was wildly turbulent, punctuated by terrifying outbursts and reports of severe abuse. Kai endured 3 years of this torment before she finally broke away, and they separated. but the toxic pull was strong, and they briefly reconciled for the sake of their young daughter. It was a mistake. The second attempt at marriage was just as poisonous and unstable as the first. By 2003, the relationship fractured permanently. They finalized their divorce, with Hwang coldly walking away, declaring to Kay, "I want to marry someone else." That wasn't just a cruel parting shot. It was a confession. For years, throughout his marriage to Kay, Hwang had been living a double life. He had been secretly entangled in a passionate affair with another woman, known as P. Their illicit romance lasted for years, built entirely on a foundation of lies. Hwang had convinced P that he was a single, unattached man with no children tying him down. Eventually, the facade cracked. P discovered the wife. She discovered the daughter. Disgusted by the deception, she packed her bags and left him. This is when the terrifying depths of Hwang's obsession truly revealed themselves. He could not handle rejection. The loss of control shattered his ego. He launched a relentless campaign of terror against P. He stalked her every move. He utilized his dark, obsessive energy to hack into her personal computer, monitoring her digital life. When he discovered she had moved on and found a new fiancé, Hwang bombarded the man with vicious, terrifying threats. But his campaign of intimidation ultimately failed. P was gone. So, left with a bruised ego and a desperate need to control a woman, any woman, Hwang's predatory gaze snapped back to his ex-wife, Kay. It was 2008. 5 years had passed since their divorce. Kay had spent that time healing, putting the pieces of her shattered life back together. She had found a new, kind partner in Mr. B. She was happy. Then the phone rang. It was Hwang. He begged her. He pleaded for another chance, spinning a web of lies about how much he had changed, how he was a new man. Kay, recognizing the trap, firmly refused. She wanted nothing to do with him. But for a man like Hwang Ju-yeon, no was not a word he comprehended. Ignoring him was not an option. He always got his way. The escalation was rapid and terrifying. Just days before the alleyway slaughter, Hwang dialed the police and initiated a horrifying psychological game. He frantically reported a fake emergency, telling dispatchers, "My wife left home saying she was going to end her own life. She won't answer the phone. I demand that you trace her whereabouts and give me her exact location." The police, thankfully, didn't bite. When the authorities failed to hand over K's location, Hwang escalated. He hired a private investigator to hunt her down. When the pie came up empty-handed, Hwang resorted to the most sickening tactic of all. He weaponized his own flesh and blood. He decided to use their elementary school-aged daughter as bait. Following their divorce, they shared custody. Hwang drafted a desperate, manipulative email to Kay. He claimed his life was falling apart. He said he had lost his job, was drowning in crippling debt, and was entirely incapable of caring for their child. He begged Kay to take the girl temporarily. It worked. Kay, entirely motivated by the love and safety of her daughter, agreed to speak with him. Hwang followed up with a tense, 13-minute phone call. They agreed to a time and a place to make the exchange. But Hwang had no intention of handing over his daughter and walking away. He was preparing for a bloodbath. Just after 8:00 p.m. on June 17th, Hwang pulled his blue Hyundai New Porter into the subterranean parking garage of the Seoul Express bus terminal. The air down there was stale, smelling of exhaust and damp concrete. He parked the vehicle. He looked at his young daughter sitting in the passenger seat. And then, he left her there. Hwang reached into his belongings and pulled out a disguise, a wig. He secured it over his hair, transforming his silhouette. He walked up into the humid evening air and slipped into the shadows of the designated alleyway. He waited in the gloom like a spider. But as he watched the mouth of the alley, his twisted fantasy hit a snag. He saw his ex-wife, Kay, walking toward the meeting spot. But she hadn't come alone. Beside her walked a man. Her new boyfriend, Mr. Lee. Hwang watched from the darkness as the couple stood face to face, conversing in hushed, serious tones. They were likely discussing him, warning each other about his volatile temper, reminding each other to keep their guard up. They were right to be afraid. The sight of K with another mount triggered an atomic explosion within Huang's psyche. The possessive rage consumed him entirely. He reached into his pocket and gripped the cold steel handle of a butterfly knife. Bursting from the shadows, his wig masking his features, Huang closed the distance in seconds. He didn't even speak. He lunged directly at Mr. B like a missile, the blade flashing under the neon lights. He drove the knife into Mr. B's stomach and chest 14 separate times. The sheer violence of the onslaught dropped Mr. B to the pavement instantly. With the new lover neutralized, Huang pivoted. He grabbed his terrified ex-wife, wrapping his thick, muscular arm around her throat in a chokehold. He began to drag her backward, plunging the blade into her chest and abdomen 18 times. Leaving them both to bleed out on the dirty concrete, Huang vanished into the city. When authorities finally located his blue Hyundai in the underground lot, they found his daughter, unharmed but abandoned. But it was what they found in the back of the vehicle that chilled them to the bone. Huang had packed a terrifying arsenal, heavy hammers, assorted hunting knives, and a shovel. This was not a crime of sudden, blind passion. He had planned to take Kay somewhere isolated. He had planned to dig a grave. It was only the unexpected presence of Mr. B that forced him to execute the slaughter right there in the city. The manhunt was instantaneous, but Huang was already moving like a phantom. CCTV footage from the following day painted a picture of a man attempting to scramble the police's radar. He was seen behaving erratically across the sprawling subway network. He rode lines back and forth, transferring at random, traveling to distant, obscure stations, and loitering on the platforms for 40 to 50 minutes at a time before moving again. It was a calculated effort to lay down a chaotic, impossible-to-follow trail. During this frantic evasion, he made a phone call to Miss K's own brother. His voice was chillingly calm. "Please take care of my daughter," he instructed his former brother-in-law. "I'm going to disappear." He made another call, this one to a close friend. The tone of this conversation was entirely different. Huang sounded jovial, arrogant. He boasted through the receiver, "I don't even understand how so many criminals get caught. I'm confident I won't be." 17 years later, his arrogant prophecy remains unbroken. The last time the unblinking eye of a security camera captured Huang Zhuyan, he was walking out of Pungnam Station. After that, nothing. Total digital silence. Detectives ripped apart what they call his life actions. They audited his bank accounts, pulled his credit records, tracked his transportation cards, and monitored his mobile devices. The footprint went completely dark. It was as if he had stepped off the edge of the earth. There was, however, one final, taunting breadcrumb. 3 weeks into the massive nationwide manhunt July 10th, the door to a smoky, dimly lit internet cafe swung open. This cafe was terrifyingly close to the original crime scene in Gundam. A man walked in. He approached the counter and registered for a computer terminal using a national lit card under the name Lee Bum-jung. This particular internet cafe, unlike the streets outside, did not have internal security cameras, but the digital logs told the police everything they needed to know. The moment this Lee Bum-jung sat down at the sticky keyboard, he navigated straight to Huang Zhuyan's personal email inbox. It was him. Huang sat in that darkened room, bathed in the glow of the monitor, and typed out messages to his closest friends and family. The emails were chillingly self-aware. He wrote that he would never be found. He explicitly stated that he knew the police would be reading these very emails, mocking their inability to catch him. Investigators traced the resident registration number on the ID card he used. It didn't belong to a Lee Bum-jung. It belonged to a local female entertainment worker, a polite term often used in Korea to describe women working in illicit, underground, nightlife establishments. How did Huang, a wanted murderer, get his hands on her ID? Police suspect that during his weeks on the run, he may have slipped into the criminal underworld, romancing or manipulating a woman at a shady hostess bar into helping him ghost the system. They also combed through his browser history from that internet cafe session. Before logging out, Huang had navigated to a job recruitment portal, specifically browsing listings for hard, manual, agricultural labor. He was looking for a way out of the city, seeking back-breaking work in deeply rural, isolated farming communities where the locals don't watch the news, and no one asks questions about a man's past. The police squeezed his inner circle. They holed in his friends and relatives, interrogating them for hours. But Huang commanded a strange, fearful loyalty. His network remained fiercely uncooperative, lips sealed tight. Detectives tried another angle. They knew Huang suffered from debilitating liporycite. He absolutely required prescription lenses to function. They printed thousands of his wanted flyers and blanketed opticians and eye clinics across the entire peninsula. They waited for the phone to ring. It never did. Over the decades, the tip line has occasionally flickered to life. Callers swore they saw the fugitive driving a cab in a coastal town or hauling bricks on a construction site in the provinces. But every time the strike teams moved in, the man they cornered was just an innocent civilian with an unfortunate resemblance to a monster. 17 years. How does a man survive in the most heavily surveilled digital fortress on Earth for almost 2 decades? Criminal profilers and investigators have narrowed it down to 4 main theories. Theory number 1. The Mountain Man. Huang was known to be an avid outdoorsman. Some speculate he fled into the dense, unforgiving mountains that cover much of the Korean peninsula, living off the land, completely detached from society. But behavioral experts heavily doubt this. Huang was a narcissist. He treated people like garbage, yes, but he needed people. He was extroverted, social, a talker. Profilers argue that a man with that specific psychological makeup would mentally break if forced into total isolation. Eventually, the crushing loneliness would drive him out of the woods and back into the neon glow of a city. Theory number 2. The smuggler's route. Did Huang flee across the sea? Escaping via the Yellow Sea to China is a well-known, albeit incredibly dangerous, ghost route for desperate fugitives. The coastal patrols are notoriously porous, and history is rife with corrupt officials willing to turn a blind eye for a fat envelope of cash. But escaping by boat requires deep connections in the criminal underworld, a trustworthy broker, and a massive amount of liquid cash, sometimes upwards of $40,000. Huang was reportedly broke. Police found absolutely zero evidence of communication with known smuggling rings. Yet, this theory is the only one that perfectly explains why his digital ghost has never triggered a single alarm inside Korea. Theory number 3. The watery grave. Many believe Huang Zhuyan is no longer breathing. His own mother has publicly stated she believes her son is dead. She even consulted shamans and psychics, who told her a chilling vision. Huang had stumbled into a deep, dark body of water and drowned, his body pulled out to sea. Without a corpse, it remains a theory, but suicide after a crime of passion is incredibly common. And finally, theory number 4. The most terrifying and perhaps the most likely. He is hiding in plain sight, protected by a network of silence. Senior investigators compare Huang's vanishing act to that of legendary prison escapee Shin Chang-won, who dodged a national dragnet for years solely through the underground assistance of others. We already know Huang stole or coerced an id from a nightlife worker within weeks of the murder. He knows how to assume a new skin. What's deeply unsettling is the devotion of his friends. When a documentary film crew attempted to investigate his hometown, they were met with a wall of hostility. One of Huang's old friends aggressively shoved the camera away, snarling, "He was like family to me. The incident's over, and I have no intention of cooperating with you. If you come over again, I might beat you up." Huang was a large, intimidating man who knew how to manipulate. It is entirely possible he terrified his inner circle into absolute silence, or charmed them into viewing him as the real victim. If he is alive, he is navigating the country as a phantom. He changes his head. He avoids credit cards. He stays off the grid. And, critically, he has likely purchased a new face. South Korea is the undisputed global capital of cosmetic surgery. 1 in 5 citizens has undergone some form of procedure. Changing a jawline, reshaping eyes, or altering a nose is as common as getting a haircut. While police distribute wanted posters to clinics, plastic surgeons are not legally bound to inform on their patients. For a doctor operating out of a discreet, high-end clinic, a thick stack of untraceable cash is often enough to buy complete anonymity. Experts believe Huang may be living deep inside a bustling, diverse industrial area, working under a forged identity, masquerading as a foreign migrant worker from China or Mongolia, seamlessly blending into a community where people keep their heads down and mind their own business. If he draws breath today, Hwang Ju-yeon is 50 years old. Time will have eroded the dense, muay muscle mass of his youth. He has likely changed his hair, his weight, and his facial structure. But a man cannot surgically alter his entire being. If you look closely, the ghosts of his past remain. He cannot change his height to 5'11". He likely still bears the twisted, asymmetrical jawline he was born with. He cannot erase the thick, scarred cauliflower ears earned from years of trading blows in the ring. He likely still possesses that deeply unsettling, unconscious stick, the way the corner of his mouth twitches upward into a cold smirk when he smiles. And above all, his eyes are failing him. His severe myopia will only have worsened with age. Someone somewhere looks at this man every single day. They hand him his change at a convenience store. They work next to him on a construction site. They share a bed with him. And they don't know that behind the thick glasses and the quiet demeanor lies a monster who butchered a woman in a dark alley. The 3,000,001 bounty, roughly $2,100, is waiting. It may seem like a small sum, especially compared to the astronomical bounties we saw in Japan. But in Korea, the fact that a bounty is publicly declared at all signifies the absolute desperation of the state. They need him found. They need the phantom dragged into the light. Which brings us to fugitive number 2. The bounty on this man's head is 10 million won. His name is Park Jong-yoon. If you passed Park on the street, your eyes would slide right off him. Born in 1960, he possesses a face so thoroughly ordinary, so aggressively unremarkable, that it borders on invisible. Yet for nearly 2 decades, this bland, middle-aged visage has been a permanent fixture on the National Police Agency's most wanted board. Park Jong-yoon is not just a fugitive. He is the prime suspect in a double homicide so cold-blooded, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it shocked even hardened detectives. And since the freezing winter of 2007, Park has been a ghost. The story of his disappearance begins with a gruesome discovery. It was the morning of September 29th, 2009. The air was biting and crisp in the remote, rugged mountains near Yeongwol, deeply embedded in Gangwon province. A local man was trekking through the dense, silent woods, his eyes glued to the forest floor, scavenging for wild mushrooms and fallen chestnuts. As he brushed aside a layer of decaying autumn leaves, his boot struck something hard. Not a rock. Plastic. He knelt down and began to dig into the cold earth. He uncovered the heavy, dirt-caked lid of an industrial rubber container. Intrigued, he pulled it free. Beneath the lid, mixed with the dark soil and scraps of rotting, moldy fabric, was something that made his blood run cold. Human bone. He scrambled back, his breath plumbing in the freezing air, and dialed the police. When the forensics team arrived, they cordoned off the silent forest. They began a painstaking excavation. They didn't just find one grave. They found 2. Buried shallowly in the earth were the skeletal remains of 2 adult men. The bodies had been decomposing in the mountain dirt for a long time, at least a year, the anthropologists estimated. Perhaps 2. It was a chilling scene of execution. The rotting fabric clinging to one of the skeletons revealed a sinister detail. The sleeves of the victim's shirt had been violently pulled back and bound tightly with thick, industrial plastic packaging string. He had been restrained, helpless. Extracting DNA from bones that have weathered to freezing mountain winters is a grueling process, but science eventually yielded the truth. The bones belonged to 2 ghosts from the Seoul underworld, who had evaporated into thin air back in 2007. The first skeleton was identified as 47-year-old Kwon-ji Kim. The second belonged to his 52-year-old muscle, a man named Pang Soyabyo. In the neon-drenched, smoke-filled backrooms of Seoul, these 2 men were infamous. Mr. Kim was a high-rolling loan shark, a man who floated immense sums of illicit cash to desperate people. Mr. Oh was his shadow, a towering, fiercely loyal bodyguard. On the streets, they were known simply as the lender and the organizer. They were apex predators in the illegal, underground gambling circuits. When they vanished in 7, the criminal grapevine whispered that they hadn't just skipped town. The word on the street was abduction, and the street was right. This case is a bitter pill for the South Korean police. They are frequently dogged by accusations of staggering incompetence. And the Yang WL discovery is a textbook example of why. Had detectives properly scoured the area back when the men first went missing, they wouldn't have had to wait 2 years to find the bodies. In late 2007, investigators actually found Mr. O's discarded jacket and Mr. Kim's leather wallet lying in the dirt at this exact mountain location. Yet, inexplicably, they failed to dig. They packed up the wallet and the jacket, entirely missing the 2 corpses rotting just inches beneath their boots. Because they lacked bodies, the prosecutors refused to issue arrest warrants. They had the prime suspects in their crushers back in 2007, but without corpses, their hands were tied. Those suspects were a 34-year-old disgruntled office worker named Nam Gang-shin and a 49-year-old taxi driver named Park Jong-yoon. The digital trail was damning. Cell phone tower pings and call logs definitively proved that Park and Nam were the very last people on Earth to communicate with the loan shark and his bodyguard before their phones went dead forever. And the motive? It was older than time. Money. Specifically, a notion of debt. Park Jong-yoon was not just a taxi driver. He was a degenerate, habitual gambler. He chased the rush of the dice and the turn of the card until it consumed his life. He was drowning in an unfathomable debt to violent crime syndicates, nearly $500,000, roughly equivalent to $350,000 at the time. Men had been killed for far less. His younger associate, Nam Gang-shin, was sinking in the exact same quicksand. Nam was hooked, utterly addicted to the underground tables, owing shadowy figures around $14,000. For 2 years, Park and Nam walked free, knowing exactly what was buried in the mountains. But the moment the mushroom forager brushed away those leaves in 2009, the clock ran out. Armed with the skeletons, the police finally got the green light. The arrest warrants were stamped. Detectives launched a covert, 2-month surveillance operation, watching the suspects from the shadows. They moved in on Nam first. It was an ordinary morning. Nam was walking to his office job, a slight bounce in his step, actually humming a cheerful tune to himself. He thought he had gotten away with murder. Then, the plainclothes detective stepped into his path. The humming stopped. The color drained from his face as the cold steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. He tried to maintain composure, but the terror broke him. In the back of the unmarked police cruiser, on the long drive to the precinct, Nam's hands began to shake violently. He buried his face in his palms and began to sob uncontrollably. They had won. Now, they needed the mastermind. The strike team kicked in the door to Park Jong-yoon's residence, but the apartment was silent. The taxi driver was gone. He had vanished like smoke. Back in the interrogation room, Nam Gang-shin sat in stony silence, refusing to utter a syllable until his defense attorney arrived. But the police had him cornered. The cell tower data, the financial records, the timeline. It was an ironclad trap. Realizing he was staring down the barrel of a life sentence, Nam's resolve crumbled. He cut a deal. In exchange for leniency, he agreed to settle. He laid out a tale of desperation, greed, and cold-blooded butchery. The tragedy was born in the shadows of Seoul's illegal gambling dens. While casinos are heavily restricted in South Korea, the hunger for gambling is rampant. Millions of citizens chase the dragon in illicit, smoke-filled basement rooms. It was in one of these miserable, windowless dens that Nam, the office worker, and Park, the taxi driver, first crossed paths. Despite a 15-year age difference, they recognized the same pathetic desperation in each other's eyes. They were losers, united by their terrible luck and their crushing debts. Nam described it to the detectives. You know how you sometimes find people who match your betting style in those places. Normally they're called fellow investigators. Well, that was us. They became partners in misery. They traveled together to Kamwon Land, the sole casino in the country where Korean citizens are legally permitted to gamble. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the tables, watching their miserable paychecks evaporate, hallucinating about the one miraculous, golden jackpot that would wipe the slate clean and save them from the mobsters breathing down their necks. In April of 2007, they thought their prayers had been answered. During a particularly tense, high-stakes underground game, Park struck up a conversation with a massive, imposing man who was playing off the clock. It was Mr. Oh, the bodyguard. The criminal underground is a small world, and rumors spread like a virus. The whisper echoing through the dim alleyways of Seoul was that O's boss, the loan shark Mr. O's boss, Kim, didn't trust banks. The rumor was that Kim drove around the city with an unimaginable fortune locked inside the trunk of his sleek Mercedes-Benz, stacks of bundled currency, totaling perhaps 200 million won. Park and Nam heard the whispers, and if this story teaches you anything, it is that the sheer, suffocating desperation of debt can rot a man's soul, turning an ordinary taxi driver into a monster willing to do the unforgivable. The trap was set on the bitterly cold evening of December 11th, 2007. Park picked up his phone and dialed the bodyguard, Mr. Helm. He invited him over to a drab, claustrophobic semi-basement room they frequently utilized for private, unregulated card games. It was a bleak space, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. When O ducked his large frame through the doorway, Park didn't deal the cards. Instead, he laid out a devil's bargain. He told the bodyguard he knew about the money in the Mercedes. He unveiled a brazen plan to hijack the fortune. All O had to do, Park whispered, was close his eyes, look the other way for 5 minutes, and they would split the massive payout 50-50. But Park had profoundly miscalculated. O was not a rat. He and the loan shark had a lucrative, symbiotic relationship. O was fiercely loyal, and he flatly refused to betray the man who paid his wages. He turned down the offer. The atmosphere in the cramped basement room instantly turned to ice. Park realized the fatal error he had just made. The cat was out of the bag. He had just pitched a violent heist to the target's personal muscle. He couldn't just let O walk up those basement stairs and warn his boss. Park's mind, poisoned by debt and panic, made a terrible, instantaneous decision. Hours later, deep into the freezing, gloomy night, Park made a second phone call. This time, he dialed his gambling partner, Nam. Come over immediately, Park's voice hissed through the receiver, vibrating with a frantic, terrifying energy. We're about to strike it big. Nam hurried through the biting winter wind, dreaming of a payday. He descended the concrete steps and pushed open the door to the basement den. The stench of copper hit him before his eyes could adjust to the dim light. There, sprawled awkwardly across the cheap linoleum floor, was the bodyguard, Mr. Boom. His skull was utterly caved in, his brains brutally bashed out onto the tiles. Park stood over the massive corpse, his breathing heavy, his hands stained. He looked at Nam with dead, shark-like eyes. He explained, entirely devoid of emotion, that the bodyguard had refused to play ball with the get-rich-quick scheme. He claimed he had absolutely no choice but to slaughter the man. Then, standing over the cooling corpse, Park presented his terrified partner with an ultimatum. Help me steal the loan shark's money, or else. Nam stared at the blood on the floor. He looked at the heavy, blunt weapon in Park's hand. He realized he was trapped in a cage with a predator. He felt he was in absolutely no position to negotiate. He nodded his head. The duo shifted into a cold, clinical mode of operation. They walked out into the freezing night, walked into a brightly lit neighborhood supermarket, and calmly purchased rolls of thick duct tape and industrial plastic string. They returned to the slaughterhouse. Now, they needed the prey. They dialed the loan shark, Mr. Kim. They lured him to the semi-basement under the irresistible pretense of an exclusive, high-stakes game. Mr. Kim arrived expecting to fleece some desperate gamblers. He stepped down into the basement. The very first thing his eyes registered was the horrifying sight of his invincible bodyguard, dead on the linoleum. The trap snapped shut. Before Kim could scream, before he could turn and run, he heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place behind him. Nam had locked the door. Park lunged. He swung a brutal, haymaker fist, connecting solidly with Kim's jaw, dropping the wealthy loan shark to the bloody floor. The grand heist, the legendary fortune in the trunk of the Mercedes. It was a ghost story, a myth. The two killers tore through Kim's pockets. They didn't find millions. They found a pathetic sum of 300,000 won in cash, about $250. They stripped the expensive wristwatch from his trembling wrist. They pulled a single credit card from his wallet. Standing over the terrified, bleeding loan shark. Park leaned down, demanded the PIN number. Kim, staring at the corpse of his friend, stammered out the digits. The moment the numbers left his lips, his usefulness ended. Park grabbed Kim by the hair, pulled his head up, and viciously drove his knee into the man's face, over and over, until the loan shark's eyes rolled back into his bruised skull, and he slipped into a dark, unconscious void.